Special thanks to the K Family Foundation, lead underwriters for MOSAIC. Hello, my name is Barbara Kay, and on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County, I'd like to welcome you to our program, MOSAIC. Our special guest on MOSAIC today is the guest speaker for the Jewish Community Center's annual book fair, Ariel Sabar. We'll be back with our guest and our program right after this brief message.
Thanks to your support, Federation maintains the fabric of the Jewish community. By enabling our community to remain vital and vibrant today and for future generations.
Mentoring more than 400 at-risk children through the Youth Futures program in Federation's partnered communities of Israel's Tzachar region.
Providing a wealth of social, welfare, spiritual and educational services available to the 110,000 members of the Jewish community in St. Petersburg, Russia.
We touch so many and do so much. Your dollars fund the work of our Federation. Thank you for your generous support.
Welcome back to MOSAIC, and welcome to you, Ariel. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Listen, I spent a good deal of the last week or two reading your books. My Father's Paradise, which is absolutely fascinating, and also the second book that we'll talk about, Heart of the City. Let's concentrate on this book,
Sure.
My Father's Paradise. Okay, what motivated you, Ariel, to write this book?
Well, you know, I grew up in Los Angeles as kind of this consummate Southern California boy. You know, I rode a skateboard, I read Surfer magazine for fashion advice, and I wanted to be this kind of consummate California kid. And I looked at my father, who came from this forgotten community of Jews in the mountains of Kurdish Iraq, Aramaic-speaking Jews. You know, he looked funny, he talked funny, he didn't know how to get his clothes to match, and I just saw him as this guy I wanted nothing to do with, because he would sort of hold me back as an American, I felt, as a kid. And as a Los Angelino who sort of bought into all the superficial values of LA.
You called yourself, considered yourself a cool kid at that time, and here was this man who
very
spoke
uncool
Aramaic.
guy. Yeah, very uncool.
Spoke Aramaic,
yes.
which is very critical, because that's a biblical language.
Right.
It was the time of Jesus, I think. And he still spoke Aramaic.
He's a scholar of Aramaic at UCLA. And so for a long time growing up, I kind of kept him at arm's length. In fact, there was a period, and I'm sort of ashamed of it now, where I even stopped calling him Abba or Dad. I just didn't want people to necessarily know we were related. And that all changed when my son, Seth, was born in 2002. And all of a sudden, you know, there's a kind of comeuppance that happens when you have a child. You realize that your own life isn't, you know, the first chapter in some brand new story or the final chapter in an ancient one, but sort of the ever unfolding story of Jewish survival in lands not our own. So as a writer, as a journalist, I thought there might be something I could do to sort of connect this faraway ancient world my dad came from with a very modern, very all-American one my son would be.
Yeah, because memories are important. That was one of the things you wanted to capture.
Yes.
Your father grew up in Zacha,
right.
Which is in northern Iraq.
Correct.
There were 2,700 Jews in this isolated place, which was incredible.
Yes.
And Explain what life was like for Jews living there at that time.
Well, it was rough. I mean, you're up in the mountains of Kurdistan, and for those who aren't familiar with what Kurdistan is, it's not a state, but it's sort of a territory, about 200,000 square miles that arcs up through Syria, northern Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and then down through Iran, marked primarily by life in these rugged mountains that had, really tough winters, hot summers. There's tribal warfare going on. It's a very kind of rough and tumble existence. And these were working class Jews. These were Jews who kind of had unusual jobs when you think of Jews. I mean, they were river rafters, for instance. They would ride logs, timber down the river to Mosul. They were farmers. They were black market smugglers. I mean, they were
clothing dyers.
They were clothing. My own great
grandfather.
grandfather. Yes. So they lived a kind of tough existence. These were tough Jews. I mean, there were, as far as I could tell, there were no Nebushes in Kurdistan.
Well, translate Nebush for our
like nerdy guys who were who couldn't see because they were bent over books. I mean, this wasn't. That's how I interpreted it anyway. I mean, this was a place where these Jews were bred tough. They had to work from a very young age. There was a limited amount of schooling. Only the children of the very, very wealthy, and when I say very, very wealthy, this is relative, in Kurdistan could go to school for more than a few years.
Yeah. How did they live with their Muslim neighbors?
Quite well. I mean, that was one of the remarkable things for me, because we look at Iraq today, we look at the Middle East, and we think of these places as sort of inescapably and eternally hostile towards Jews, but that's actually a fairly recent phenomenon. For about 3,000 years, Jews lived in relative harmony with their Muslim and Christian neighbors up in the mountains. I mean, I can give you some examples. I mean, Muslims would stub their cigarettes in respect as Jews filed home from synagogue on Saturdays. They would, Jews would forego smoking during the month of Ramadan out of respect. My uncle Tzion was the kosher kebab king of Mosul in his day. Hard to believe.
Kosher kebabs?
Kebab king, yeah. He had a great kosher kebab shop in Mosul. Hard to imagine today, because Mosul was sort of one of the hubs of the insurgency. But back in the day, you would go to Tzion Kebabchi, Tzion the kebab guy, and Tzion bought his meat not from a sort of kosher Jewish butcher, but from an Arab Muslim butcher who let a rabbi into his shop to sort of certify that the cuts hewed to the Jewish dietary law. So there was this really remarkable cooperation. One of my great uncles was like the personal secretary to the tribal chieftain, the Muslim tribal chieftain of the town. I mean, so Jews were in trusted positions, and it was really a story of tolerance in a part of the world that we don't associate with that today.
It's amazing, They were quite far from the Jews of Baghdad. I mean, Baghdad had an enormous Jewish population.
Yes.
I think a third of the population in Baghdad was Jewish.
Correct. After World War I, and that statistic shocked me, 1 out of 3 Baghdadis
Yeah,
was
that was
Jewish.
just incredible. And they were, merchants, and they were living in a city, very commercial. And yet, they still, even though Zachau was so far away, they still maintained the same religious kind of connection. Baghdad had a heavy Jewish population with the rituals, and Zachar did too.
Yes.
And there was no connection whatsoever.
They were separated by perhaps 250 miles, not that great of a distance, but it was almost as if the Kurdish Jews were living on another planet. They very rarely ventured down to Baghdad. Again, only the sort of bigger merchants in Zachau did that. It was a long trip. And Baghdad was sort of at the center of Mesopotamian civilization. The Jews there built major yeshivas. They rose to very high positions in government, including the Iraqi parliament. Even the secretary in the Iraqi cabinet was Jewish. And so they had very prominent positions, and that part of the diaspora, sort of Babylonian Jewry as it was called, was very, very, very well known. But the Assyrian Jewry, which was actually part of an older exile from the Holy Land, wasn't very well known. It wasn't barely even mentioned in the Talmud. So these Jews, the Bible actually writes them off as the lost tribes, they that were lost in Assyria. And if you look at sort of Assyria and what it meant back in biblical days, it's basically Kurdistan. But those Jews weren't lost. They were just kind of too far outside the Beltway, the Jewish Beltway, for anyone to notice.
Yeah, but it was interesting. I'm jumping ahead because I want to come back to what got you involved in the initial aspect of this book. But what was interesting is after this book was published, there were a lot of Kurdistani Jews, pronounce that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, who were so excited about your book and the fact that you brought it to public consumption, people were amazed. So you did a mitzvah, which is a blessing.
Thank you. Well, that was one of the most touching things for me, to feel like I was sort of reconstituting, in a small way, a community that had really been torn asunder, and to receive these emails from Kurdish sons and daughters of Kurdish immigrants who were of my generation saying, I always wanted to know this stuff. My father or mother never talked about it. I didn't think that we had a culture, and here it is in this book. And as a writer and as the son of a Kurdish Jew, it's very, very moving.
Yeah, well, this takes you on a very interesting trip. Okay, tell me your first impact of what you felt when you got into this and started to do this.
Well, when I first started, I was working as a reporter at the Baltimore Sun. I had been a daily journalist.
You had to
for 12
take off
years.
a lot of time for
I
this.
quit. I quit my job without a book contract, without an agent, because I worried that that the people who were in a position to remember life in Kurdistan, most particularly my father, were getting older, and that if I didn't act when I did, they might not be around much longer. And so there was this real sense of I felt this real burden and onus to act now, or else lose these stories forever. And so there was a sense of urgency. I mean, that's what I mostly felt, is I got to get out and do this now, or else I risk not only losing ties with my past, but I miss a chance to tell what I felt would be a really compelling story.
Yeah, you also gave you a chance to reconnect with your father.
Yes.
Which was very critical. You went on a trip with him. Share that experience.
Well, I as a daily journalist, I was certain from the moment I started writing the book that we would need to go back to Zacho. That there was no way to credibly tell a story about reconnecting with your roots without actually going back to that place. The only problem was that Zacho is in the country of Iraq, and I had this great idea.
Dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, this was 2005. It was the middle of the insurgency. And my father, who had come from there, was, kind of become a cautious scholar. He was in his late 60s, and he didn't think that 2005 was necessarily the best time for a sentimental journey to Iraq by two American Jews. He may have had a point there. And so he kind of tried to tell me, we don't need to go. You can just interview Kurdistani Jews in Israel. I can show you some videos. You can read a few books. You'll be good. And this is the difference between a scholar and a journalist. I'm like, no, Dad, we are going. And so we struggled a little bit. And I think he finally sort of called me out and said, well, if I don't go with you, will you still go? And I said, yes, I will. And then he said, well, then I have to go with you. Because I think he felt in a very paternal way that if something happened to me because I didn't understand the language or the culture, that he would be responsible.
Yeah.
So we went together to Zacho in 2005. And it was really a tremendous experience for us.
Yeah, what you found too, which was very interesting, was the fact that even though there were no longer any Jews in Zacho, the Muslims treated you with extreme courtesy.
Yes.
They over sweet tea.
Yes.
And graciousness. They sat with you and invited you into their home.
Indeed.
I mean, do you think that ever could happen again?
I
in
think,
all of Iraq?
I view the story as a hopeful one in a way. I think it shows us that we don't have to take the present as a guide to the future, because the past perhaps is more instructive, that there was a time when more did unite us than divide us. And so I look to the past as sort of a signpost that we can do better. Because I think the Kurds are exceptional in many ways. This is a non-Arab ethnic minority. It's actually the largest ethnic group in the world, the Kurds are, without a state of their own. And so they actually are very Western oriented. They have a fondness for the Jews, because guess what another large non-Arab ethnic group in the Middle East is that does have a state? I mean, it's the Jews. So they actually are very fond of Israel. They're fond of the Jews. I think it's no secret to a lot of people that the Kurds have a relationship with, like, the Mossad, for instance, because these are people who do look at the world in something of the same way. They're surrounded by groups of people who are hostile towards them. And so there's a lot of fellow feeling there. Plus, the older generation remembered Jews as neighbors, as friends, as business partners. And in fact, one of them said, well, when are you coming back? We miss you. Why don't you come back? We have room for you still. And that was just really very cool. Not something I'd expected.
On that note, we're going to take a break. We'll be back with the remainder of our program right after this brief message.
Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County makes so much possible every day.
Serving tens of thousands of kosher meals to seniors and families through food pantries, the Jewish Hunger Response, holiday meals, and on-site meal programs.
Operating the Jewish Community Assistance Network in 6 local communities to provide health, wellness, and social programs to more than 2,000 seniors.
But we need your help. Volunteer your time. Pledge your support. Make a difference. Thank you for your generous support.
Welcome back to Mosaic. Prior to the break, we were talking about the wonderful tolerance and sense of acceptance that you found when you went back to Kurdistan, visiting with your father to write the book. And of course, there were no Jews left because, I think, was it 1950? All of the Jews went to Israel.
Yes, between 1948 and 1951,
Yeah.
almost all of the Jews in Iraq were airlifted to the new state of Israel.
Israel, which was a big change for your father.
It was. He was the last boy bar mitzvahed in his hometown.
In his
of
hometown.
Zakho. And so it was very significant for him as a writer of nonfiction. We're always looking for ways in which truth serves up a kind of metaphor. And for me, I thought it was very critical that at the very moment Jewish law deemed my father a man, he was wrenched from this kind of childhood paradise that he could never return to. And so, and it wasn't safe to go back. After the Jews left, even though they had lived there amid tolerance for nearly 3,000 years, things were changing. With the founding of the State of Israel, hostilities were growing in the Arab world, including Iraq. And so my father couldn't safely go back. So this paradise of tolerance, of these beautiful rivers he swam in, of the wonderful old men with long beards he remembered, the kids he played with along, knuckle bones with, it's an old game sort of like jacks, but using stones by the river. All of that was just sort of locked away in his memory, and it became this kind of nostalgia. And so his language of Aramaic is really the only thing he takes with him, and it becomes like literally his life's calling. He winds up becoming a professor of Aramaic at UCLA, and it was astonishing to me to see that journey. Here was a man, a kid who was born in a mud shack to an illiterate mother in the mountains of Kurdistan, then somehow winds up on a graduate scholarship to Yale University, and then one of the great scholars of Aramaic at UCLA now.
He wrote the journey is all documented in this book.
Yes.
But it's a really good read. I mean, it's exciting. I couldn't wait till I get to the next page.
Thank you.
At any rate, it's an amazing story, and it's also an amazing story of redemption in the sense you felt. Even though you couldn't find your father's sister, she was stolen. That's another story.
Yes.
And you could not find her. You searched when you went on the trip. Nonetheless, you and your father had the most wonderful resurgence of love for one another.
That was on a personal level. That was really the biggest outgrowth of the book for us, was that suddenly we had something to talk about. Before, I thought this was a man who had nothing to show me, who we shared no common cause, no common ground. And then, discovering that we share a lot. Not that we're the same person. We're not. We are different people. But now we have this common ground that unites us. And whenever I'm talking on the phone with him from Los Angeles, where he lives now, say that we run out of things to say to each other about the grandkids, I can always keep the conversation going by turning back to some of these stories. Tell me the story about Zion the kebab guy again. Tell me more. I want to know more. Or what was that thing you were saying about Aramaic that was interesting? And so we have this sort of shared purpose now, which is really
he changed his name when he went to Israel.
He did. In fact, they changed their name twice. In Zakho, they were known as Be Sabar, which means house of the dyer, as in a dyer of cloth.
Dyed cloth.
That's what my great grandfather did. And then when they came to Israel for the first time, they changed their name to Sabar, which is an Arabic name meaning sort of the same thing, but it doesn't it doesn't quite so tar you as being from Kurdistan, because there were a lot of prejudice towards the Kurdistani Jews. Sabag could be from anywhere in the Middle East. Besabag was Aramaic, clearly you're from Kurdistan. And then after my father goes to the army, he's like, you know what, even that is too much of a millstone. I don't want to carry this thing around my neck. Sabag, you know, the Middle Eastern Jews faced a lot of prejudice. There was a lot of European prejudice towards the Middle Eastern Jews, so he changed it to Sabar.
Sabar.
Which is the sort of the cactus fruit, which is sort of the national symbol of the Israeli character, right? Like prickly on the outside, sweet on the inside.
Sweet on the inside, that's right.
And it was so, I mean, it's so dramatic, really, to go, it would, and I talk about this in the book, the equivalent would be to, if you were coming through Ellis Island and at the mythical, you know, name-changing table or whatever, you suddenly declared that your name from here on out was John America. My father was Yonah Israel, basically. And it was such a dramatic turnaround. And for me, it was interesting because he had also pushed away from his roots in Israel. He was also trying to remake himself, and then winds up boomeranging and coming back and saying, wait a second, maybe there is something important about this language of Aramaic that I'm a native speaker of. Maybe I'm in a position to do something to keep this language alive, at least to preserve it for scholars.
He compiled a dictionary.
Yes.
Of Aramaic, which is incredible, actually.
Yeah.
And he keeps adding to it.
Keeps adding to it. He keeps wanting to add to it. So he's constantly remembering. And this is a dictionary, remember, that comes from remembered childhood words. A lot of this was sort of literally words that he spoke as a child that he then was not encouraged to speak once he got to Israel. So there was this, again, I think he also felt a sense of urgency that something valuable was being lost. A language that had once been the common language of the entire Middle East. It was the language of the Talmud. It was the language of the early diaspora.
We still use it in prayers.
Yeah, you use the biblical version of Aramaic. Absolutely,
yes.
in Kol Nidre and in the Mourner's Kaddish.
That's right.
My father speaks what's called Neo-Aramaic, which is the Aramaic that survives after the Islamic conquest. And of course, after the Islamic conquest, Arabic replaces Aramaic as the common language of the Middle East.
Okay, let's take it a step further now.
Sure.
You put out this book called Heart of the City.
Mm-hmm.
And what's so interesting is that you talk about, first of all, we're on the same subject because it begins with a love story of your mother and father.
Yes.
But it talks about the psychology of space.
Yes.
And how things happen if they're in a certain space. You want to share that with our viewers?
Yeah, and I'll, just to connect it with the first book, I mean, a very important part of my father's immigrant journey was when he's at Yale and he winds up in New York City one day. Sees this woman in Washington Square Park in the heart of Greenwich Village and approaches her with a very clunky pickup line, something like, "Are you also a tourist?" Which would send a lot of women running in the other direction, but he quickly recovers by mentioning two things. One is that he's a graduate student at Yale, and the other is that he's Jewish, and 4 months later, they're married. So the more I heard of their story, the more interested I became in the role of the park itself and kind of bringing these two very, very different people together. And that was sort of the inspiration for the book. I wanted to go out and find other couples who had also met by chance in one of New York City's iconic public spaces.
No, but it's interesting because you say a lot of these people, when you come into New York, it's kind of an impersonal place.
Yes.
People are wandering, tons of people on the street. You don't stop anybody. Somebody new to that environment is intimidated.
Absolutely.
And wants to make a friend, wants to reach out, but has no place unless they find an intimate space.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think for my father, Washington Square Park brought this sort of blinding rush of Manhattan down to a human scale. It resembled a village, he thought. And in fact, he told me that he had actually spotted my mother on the street outside, but didn't felt like it would be appropriate or safe to approach her there. But once she was in this sort of sanctuary of the park, he felt like he could, and with obviously long-lasting results. And there is a science to this, as it turns out, that if a place is beautiful, if it makes your pulse race in some way, if it gives you something to look at, whether a street performer, a juggler, then it's the sort of place that in which strangers are more likely to strike up a conversation with one another. And density also matters. Crowds matter. Crowds just put us in more frequent contact with other people. And when you have there are more sparks flying, the chances of romance are greater. So it's a fun book. It's a lot lighter than the first one.
Oh yes.
But it was nice to sort of, after 3,000 years of Kurdish Jewish history, to just sort of take a deep breath and do something fun.
Where did you find some of the people that you write about?
Every conceivable way. I was a journalist for many years, so I used all of the same tools. I searched decades and decades of wedding announcements through online databases. I called up priests, rabbis, and wedding photographers in New York City,
Did you
asking
really?
them for leads. Yeah, who did you marry recently that met in a public space? Word of mouth. I also just posted on blogs and Craigslist, just sort of with the details of my search, hoping that some great stories would wash back.
You had some of them that would refuse to give their name.
You know,
I mean, they wouldn't allow you to publish their name.
Yeah, you know, I respected that. We actually had to. My publisher said we need, because these are private stories, we have to give each of the couples a chance to request pseudonyms if they want them. And I was worried because as a daily journalist, you know, you can't use pseudonyms. You have to use real names. In a book, it's okay. And I was pleased that only 3 of the 9 requested that pseudonyms be used. And understandably, these were some of the younger couples who, you know, were starting out in their careers, you know, didn't know where life would lead necessarily, and didn't necessarily want some future boss to know all the intimate details of their courtship. So
some of them they're very unique and fascinating. But what you do at the end is you don't leave the reader hanging, because you tell the history of what's taking place now.
Yes.
And at least you give them a measure of comfort, right?
You do. I did want to. We do have a sort of a postscript section in which we catch people up on where the couples are now. The actual main tales in the book end at the moment when the relationships sort of are headed for marriage. But that would leave people hanging. I think.
It was too. I was. Oh, why? Well, how am I going to know what's going to happen?
Yes.
But then I found the end of the book, so I was okay. But okay. Did you enjoy writing this book?
I did. Again, you know, just to do something fun. It used a lot of the same tools that I used for the first book. It's narrative nonfiction, so you use the techniques of fiction, of sort of novel writing, to tell true stories. And I was lucky in that the first newspaper I ever worked at in Providence, Rhode Island, was known as a writer's paper. So the editors encouraged us to take risks with our writing, to tell stories when we needed to tell stories. It didn't always have to be sort of a who, what, when, where lead or beginning to a story, and that was a real treat. One of my editors very wisely said to me one day that people don't curl up at night with a great set of facts, which I thought was which was very good.
So
instruction.
you want me to give you a direction for this?
Yes. So tell stories, and that's what's always animated me as a writer.
Yeah, short stories, and well. Okay, what's next on the agenda for Ariel Sabar?
Well, I'm actually taking a short break from books. I'm working on a number of magazine stories. Again, all about sort of people. I'm fascinated by people, what makes them tick, and if I have a chance to spend several days with a stranger, figuring out about their lives, what animates them, I'll take the job. So I'm writing a number of longer pieces for magazines now.
Well, Ariel Sabar, it was a pleasure. I can't wait to get the next book.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
It was a pleasure, and thank you for being with us as well. Be with us again next week when we have another look into the Jewish world. Goodbye from